Good evening, everybody. Oh, wow, that's working. Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming here this evening. It's great to see you all. Tonight, we're going to be having a short chat with the polymath, writer, playwright, film script writer, and various other fantastic deeds person, Michael Frayn. I'm going to do a quick interview with some questions to introduce Mr. Frayn to you all, and then we'll open up to the floor. And if you have any questions, and I hope you do, please don't hesitate to make your point heard. It'd be fantastic. Right, so start off with the obvious one, I think. You're most well known for being an incredibly successful playwright. What made you decide to go into theatre?
Well, it was a rather complicated path because I used to detest theatre and despise theatre. And I didn't get started on writing for theatre until I was in my late 30s. Most theatre writers start when they're young. Well, I did start when I was here at Cambridge. I wrote the Footlights May Week review, and it was a flop. Nobody laughed. And I was like the fox in the fable, turned against, said sour grapes, and turned against the theatre, and spent a lot of my early career. Well, I was, first of all, a reporter on The Guardian, then I was a columnist on The Guardian and The Observer. And I wrote a great many columns saying how ghastly the theatre was. If you went to the theatre, you were just embarrassed. You were just waiting for the actors to forget their lines and drop their props. And I also read a lot of parodies of plays by people who are now professional colleagues of mine. And it was only in my late 30s that, like the atheist who comes to mock but stays to pray, I was slowly wound into the theatre. And it happened because someone I knew who was doing a collection of short plays about the state of marriage, the theatre, phoned me and said, would I write a one-act play about marriage? Well, if someone issues a challenge like that, it's difficult to resist it. So reluctant as I was to get involved in the theatre, I said I would. So I wrote a very naive short play about a young couple who make a nostalgic return visit to their honeymoon hotel in Venice. Only now they've got a small child. And the play was about the difference that children make to their parents' lives. So I handed this in, and a week later the director phoned and said, I'm terribly sorry, the producer says you can't do this, it's too filthy. Well, the producer was a man called Alexander Cohen, an American producer working on this occasion in London, and he was famous for doing difficult material, stuff that the audience resisted. And in fact, he did the first Broadway production of Pinter's The Homecoming. Very difficult to persuade a Broadway audience in those days to watch The Homecoming. And I said, Alex Cohen says, my play, my innocent little play, is too filthy. And the director said, yeah, he says he could never do a play in which a baby's nappy is changed on stage. So I was so cross about that, I wrote 3 more short plays and had an evening of short plays of my own. And that was my first show in the theatre. It was absolutely catastrophic. In those days, there was a gallery claque who used to go to all the first nights. They all knew each other, and in the interval they would go out and have a drink together and decide whether they liked the play or not. And if they didn't like it, they would come back and they would boo and heckle and catcall through Act 2. And they didn't like my play, and they came back and they booed and heckled and catcalled throughout Act 2 and booed the cast at the end. And then I thought, carrying criticism a little far, they booed me personally in the street outside afterwards. Well, the only good thing about the evening was that, as you know, actors like to exchange little presents on first nights. And one of there were 2 actors in the play, Richard Briers and then Redgrave. And Richard Briers gave me as a first night present a biography of Noel Coward. Well, I didn't know much about Noel Coward. All I knew was he's had a life of glittering, unbroken success. But when I read the biography, I discovered it wasn't like that at all. It had many, many flops. But the flops had got forgotten. And the lesson was that flops, by their very nature, come off very quickly, so not many people see them. And successes, by their very nature, tend to stay on, so a lot of people see them. So on the whole, if you can manage to hang in there, people more people remember the hits than remember the flops. So that was a sort of moral lesson for life. So that's how I got started in the theatre.
What would you consider your greatest hit?
A play I wrote called Noises Off, which is a farce by far my most successful play. It's done all over the world. Why? Heaven knows. When it was first done in this country, I mean, I didn't think anyone would ever perform it. I just thought that I'd just gone off the edge of the cliff here. I'd just get the thing finished and I put it on the shelf and forget about it. I was amazed when anyone performed it here. And it was a success in London, but people said, well, okay, it would work in this country, but you could never do it anywhere else in the world because it's based on a pastiche of English British sex farce, and no one else knows about it. Well, it's now been done absolutely everywhere in the world. They do theatre. In fact, they've just opened a production of it in Hamburg with a very distinguished German director called Luc Percival, who had never done a comedy before. He's mostly done Shakespeare and Dostoevsky. And Luc Percival has decided that my play, which is a farce, is not a comedy, that it's a play of existential angst. And he has managed to remove every single laugh from the play. I'm pleased to say he got booed on the first night. The reviews are absolutely terrible. And some journalist in Detroit has actually defended the play against the director and attacked the director. So it's my only, I know you've lived in Germany, haven't you?
Yes.
I love Germany. My only argument with Germany is about the way they do theatre. Because German theatre is dominated by what they call Regietheater, director's theatre. The director is king. And the aim of a lot of German directors is, if possible, to totally destroy the text of the play they're doing, remove all sense of it. And I must say Mr. Percival has done brilliantly on that front. But I can't help feeling there's also room for directors who actually try to do the play and make sense of it and have a collaborative joint effort with the writer to make something good.
Does it frustrate you when directors, because I know it's a bit of a thing that occasionally directors do take plays and go, well, we can't have that line in there and we can't have that particular scene, that doesn't make sense, blah, blah, blah. Does it annoy you when directors sort of corrupt a writer's work when it's not really their job?
Yeah, it does. That's why I have an argument with German theatre. It doesn't work like that in this country. British directors on the whole are very responsive to writers. And most of my plays have been, the first productions have been done by a great friend of mine, Michael Blakemore. And his great skill is, his first great skill is to work with the writer and work through the text with them, make sure that he understands what's involved, tries to persuade the writer to make things clearer if they're not clear, simpler if they can be simpler, shorter if they can be shorter, and so on. So it's a real collaboration between writer and director. But I have another play called Copenhagen, and since one of the characters is the great German physicist Werner Heisenberg, I was very keen that this should be done well in Germany. I went to see the first German production, which was done in a small town just outside Bremen, and discovered that it was done as a circus performance. And that Heisenberg, in the course of the play, turned 4 back somersaults. I don't mean metaphorical back somersaults, I mean literal back somersaults. And they gave Margareta Bohr a typewriter. So every time Heisenberg and Niels Bohr began to go on rather boringly about physics or politics, whatever, she would hammer on the typewriter so you couldn't hear what they were saying. So I was very fed up about that, yeah.
Why did you decide to write a play about nuclear physics, of all things?
Why indeed? Because I know very little about science. But I read what was then called moral sciences here, which is now called philosophy. A pity, because no one had the faintest idea what moral sciences were. It sounded rather impressive. Everyone's got a philosophy department. But if you do philosophy, you can't help but come across something to do with quantum mechanics, because the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics are so weird, and they go on getting weirder and weirder. So I knew something about what Niels Bohr and Heisenberg had been doing in the 1920s when they developed quantum mechanics together in Copenhagen. And then I read a book by an American writer, Thomas Powers, called Heisenberg's War, which talked about an aspect of Heisenberg's life I hadn't known about, which is the time he spent working with the German team that was trying to develop nuclear power, possibly to develop a nuclear weapon. And an extraordinary visit he'd made in the middle of the Second World War in 1941 to Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. And the great question is, everyone speculated about, is why he did it. Because they'd been not only very close collaborators, they'd been great friends, but it was extremely embarrassing for Niels Bohr to receive a visit from a German in 1941 because Denmark was occupied by Germany, and Niels Bohr didn't want to be seen to be giving comfort to the enemy. And Heisenberg was very insistent he wanted to see Bohr. So why did he make the trip? What did he want to say? What did he actually say? The two men couldn't agree. They had a private conversation somewhere, nobody else heard it, and they couldn't agree what had actually been said. And no one could ever agree what Heisenberg's motivation was. And I thought there was a kind of parallel here with the uncertainty principle that Heisenberg introduced into physics, which says that you can never have complete knowledge about the behavior of anything, but certainly not of a fast-moving particle. And for completely different reasons, it seems to me, you can never have complete knowledge, complete understanding of people's motivation, why people do what they do. Even of your own motivation, why you do what you do yourself. You can make estimates all the time, and we all have to make estimates of what other people are going to do and why they're doing it, what their motives are. And it's a very fundamental question, because until you've made some kind of estimate of people's reasons for doing something, you can't really judge their behavior. Just the abstract fact that someone has stuck a knife into somebody else, or whatever it is, remains morally inert until you know why they've done it. That was the...
Yeah, do you think, so this is sort of clearly a play that sort of has, I've seen it a few times, that has a lot of various philosophical connotations, which you've explained. Why do you think that the stage, the theatre, is a decent medium, is a good medium on which to sort of convey such deep philosophical questions? Because normally sort of books are seen as the main repository of such sort of ideas, and sort of to have something on stage of that nature is quite new.
Well, the play is a kind of investigation of Heisenberg and Niels Bohr, who are long dead, come back and have a discussion and try to establish what had actually happened at that meeting in Copenhagen. And it seemed a kind of natural format for a question where there are different possible sides. The drama is a very natural way of doing it. Also because the great difference between plays and books is that in novels, you can usually know why people do what they do. The author can know. Doesn't have to, but if you think of most of the books you've read, it's full of things like he felt bitterly resentful at what she said, or she decided to do this or do that, which suggests the author knows. Well, you can do that in a novel. You can't do it in a play. Characters can tell you what they think and what their motive is, but then you have to trust that they're telling you the truth, and trust that they understand themselves, which of course they don't always do. So it seemed a natural way of doing it.
You've written a few sort of very sort of deep plays. I'm thinking Copenhagen and Democracy, amongst others. You're saying Copenhagen was broadly based on this book that you read. Do you do much research in sort of the exact historical background of these events, or is there a certain amount of sort of literary freedom?
I did every possible research I could do for both Copenhagen and Democracy. Democracy is about German politics at the time of Willy Brandt's chancellorship, and it's about Willy Brandt's chancellorship ending when it was discovered that his personal assistant, who was very devoted to him, an extremely effective personal assistant, was also a spy working for the Stasi. I did every possible piece of research, but in the end, the plays are fictions, and I've tried to make clear in the postscript to the play what I've taken from the historical record and what I've invented. And it seems to me it's fair to do that. And it seems to me the point is that from the historical record, you can never penetrate the heads of the characters. You make estimates from outside, and what we all want to know is what's going on inside people's heads and hearts. And that's what the writer of fiction can attempt to do, to be inside his or her characters. So that was the reason for doing that.
So both of these two plays are very much based on historical events. When it comes to writing sort of your fictions, Noises Off is sort of the ideal example. Where do you get your sort of inspiration for these fantastic plays from?
I think the takeoff point for Noises Off, I mean, ideas just fall into your head. It fall into everyone's head for all kinds of things. I mean, where are you going on for holiday, or what subject are you going to read at university or whatever? I don't know where the ideas come from. You just find it's taken root in your head. But I think Noises Off started when I went to see the show I was talking about, the two of us, these short plays of mine. One of the short plays was a farce performed by the two actors in the play, so I'm playing 5 characters between them. And one night I went to watch it backstage, and I saw them running from door to door, doing quick changes as they went. And I thought, this is funnier than what's going on around the front. And I'd like to write a farce seen from behind, which is a very simple ambition to have. But it turned out to be unbelievably difficult to do. And it took me many years and many drafts doing it in different ways before I came up with something.
I gather that after the first production, you thought that just the last act or whatever just wasn't up to scratch, ditched it completely and made the actors learn a new one. Was that true?
Well, it wasn't quite like that. We had previews, and in previews, of course, one of the things about previews, it gives you a chance to rewrite if something's not clear, whatever. And as originally staged, the play was a farce for 2.5 acts. And then in the last half of the last act, it followed Mr. Luke Percival's idea that it's really not a farce, it's really a play about existential angst. And it became very clear that the audience absolutely did not want to hear about existential angst at that point in the evening. And I had to do something about it. So I then started rewriting. I rewrote every day the end of Act 3 until finally one of the actors was deputed to come and say that the actors were going to refuse to learn any more variants. But I still haven't got it right, and every time it's been produced, there's been a major production of it in this country or America since, I've rewritten the end.
Do you think there are some people in theatre, I'm thinking of various directors who go on about existential angst, who take themselves a bit too seriously?
Yes, particularly I think in Germany, where there's a director who's extremely influential in Germany at the moment called Kriegenburg, and he believes that the theatre can't present action, it can only present a narrative, whereas all the rest of us naively and stupidly believe that the great thing about the theatre is it actually presented action in front of your eyes, whereas you do narrative elsewhere. Kriegenburg said absolutely not. And he's had a huge influence in Germany, and I gather he's got a production somewhere of one of the Chekhov plays. And what this has got to do with his thesis, I haven't the faintest idea, but what happens in this play is the backcloth, it goes on for 5 hours, and the backcloth very slowly falls on the cast in the course of the 5 hours until they're all crushed.
Is this a set of Chekhov plays?
This is one of the Chekhov, I can't remember which one.
You, of course, have a very sort of close connection with Chekhov, being sort of seen as one of the finest translators of Chekhov in England. Sort of what is it about Chekhov that sort of makes it just so interesting? attractive to this?
Well, he's one of the greatest writers in the world, not just for the stage, but as a story writer as well. And I started translating Chekhov because I was asked to, but I got absolutely hooked because it's actually wonderful translating something because it's like original writing without any of the angst and worry. You sit there, you know what kind fathers sometimes do with little children. They sit them on their lap to drive a car on a country road, and the child holds the steering wheel, and daddy operates the pedals underneath. Well, translating something is a bit like that. You're sitting in the lap of some great writer, and he's operating all the pedals, and you're just holding the steering wheel saying, look, I'm driving the car. And you have the sensation of writing something wonderful, and you know it's wonderful. I mean, that's one of the difficulties of writing, is you never know whether it's going to work or not. That makes you very anxious. But if you're translating something, you know it works, or people wouldn't have asked you to translate it. So you have the sensation of translating this wonderful thing, and somebody else has done all the awful hard work of working out the plot and creating the characters.
Because you'll freely admit that some plays are flops. Do you know beforehand? Can you tell once it's written, right, this just isn't going to go well?
No one knows whether a play is going to be a flop or not until it's done. It's one of the chastening things about the theatre is that you haven't the faintest idea. No one has. The writer, the director, the producer, the actor, no one has the faintest idea whether the thing is going to work until you get in front of an audience. An audience is an absolutely vital part of the theatre. Theatre is not just actors talking to themselves on the stage. The theatre is people actually presenting something to people who sit out there and trying to make sense of it. And until you get in that situation, you really don't know. And no one does, not even producers whose living depends on guessing right. And my worst flop was a play called Look, Look. And in the rehearsal room, we all thought we got a winner. The producer came to see the last run through. And a very picky producer, never remembered to say he liked something. He always just started in on notes saying, why does she do this? And couldn't we cut that? And after it, I said, okay, what are your notes? He said, no notes. I said, oh, come on, no, let's get down to business after the notes. He said, no, it's wonderful. It's very, very funny. So that was a terrific day. And then we got into the theatre, first preview audience. We knew we had a corpse on our hands. And whatever you do, we knew that I was going to rewrite all the way through previews, and the cast were going to have to learn new versions of it, which we did. But as you know, if you start with a corpse, whatever you do to it, you end up with a corpse. And we ended up with a corpse.
So it's clear from this particular story that you get quite involved in sort of the play sort of throughout the rehearsals and so on. I'm aware that there are some writers that do sort of write back and sort of say, well, my job is done now, let's give it to the director. Do you think that it's sort of a good idea throughout the entire production series to have sort of people rewriting, to have sort of various collaboration? Because I'll freely admit that I've acted in a few plays, and there's one that stands out for having too many people at the helm all trying to run this thing. Because people often, there's always an argument, especially in theatres, that, well, the director is king, and so you have to do what he says. Do you think it's better to have a collaboration on board?
Well, I'll tell you what I do. I work with this director I always work with, and we work very closely on the text. And he makes me actually read it aloud to him, which is a very painful process because I have no acting ability at all. But it means we look at every line, and he asks stupid questions. Why does she do that? And it's obvious why she does that. And then you think about it, well, not obvious at all. I haven't made this clear. And then, once we get into the rehearsal room, I let him get on with it and let the director and the actors do it and wait until they say there's something to look at in front of an act. Very helpful, really, if somebody stays out of rehearsals and comes in with a fresh eye and says, look, it's changed since last time, it's got better in this way, but we've lost something in some other way. But some writers don't take that view at all. Some insist on being present all the way through rehearsals, rewrite in the rehearsal room, fall out with the directors, get banned from the rehearsal room and the theatre. It's all very dramatic. It's very boring in my case.
Well, it leads to good newspaper stories about it at any rate.
Yeah.
Who would you consider the greatest playwright ever, then? Sort of both through actually what they wrote and through the methodology with which they do it. You can't choose Shakespeare. That's gone.
Yeah. Well, I gave up attempting to read literature at university because I could never do literary answers. And I think I could never be a critic. So I never have any critical ideas about it. So my views about what a great play is absolutely not worth having. But of course, I can't help putting in a pitch for Chekhov because he is a really great writer.
You've also sort of recently, although this started a while ago, branched out into actually writing sort of books and novels and fiction.
Well, I wouldn't say recent. I was writing novels before I was writing plays.
Which do you prefer? Sort of plays through the audience interaction, sort of the idea of the staging, or in a novel where there's sort of more freedom for the reader to interpret it as they wish?
Well, I don't think I prefer one or the other. Just some ideas seem to be for one, and some ideas seem to be for the other. You don't have very much choice about it, and you just do it. And if it goes relatively easily, you can't help liking it and thinking you've got something good. And if it's difficult, you can't help feeling very fed up with it.
Thank you very much. We're now going to open up to the audience. If anyone has any questions for Michael, please put your hand up and we'll see what he has to say. If not, I'm just going to natter on and you'll learn some more about my own personal interests in writing and theatre and various other things. Yes, in the corner.
As a member of the older generation, can I ask a question? Is it working?
Yes, that's working.
Yeah. Oh, good. I have memories of the Footlights, having been a member a long time ago, and especially of smoking concerts, the Dorothy Cafe. Do you have such memories also? And do you remember anything in particular?
Well, I remember that the first money I earned when I was a student, which was for winning an advertising competition for the Observer, I spent on a dinner jacket so that I could go to Footlight Smokers, because I don't know what happens now, but in those days, it was all men, there were no women, and you had to wear a dinner jacket. And I wrote, as I said, I wrote the Footlights in my last year, not a success, but the one thing I can claim is that I insisted on having women in it. So it was, I think, the first Footlight show that had women in. But even that didn't save it.
Were there any Footlights from your time who have also gone on to sort of remain in acting and theatre and so on?
Yes, a man who was in my show called Joe Melia became a very good actor with the RSC. I think he was virtually the only one.
Because I've noticed that you also wrote a script for a film starring John Cleese, which I have seen, which is very funny, called Clockwise. So what were the differences between sort of writing for the stage and writing for the screen?
Well, one of the good things of writing for the theatre is it's a very limited form which concentrates your mind. You have to end up with something which can be done, really said by relatively few people in a relatively restricted space. I mean, you can represent a much wider piece of the world than is in the theatre, but as soon as somebody suggests some restrictions, it stimulates your imagination. And one of the difficulties of writing the cinema is you can have enormous numbers of actors, set the thing anywhere. You don't have to imagine the landscape or the townscape or whatever you're looking at, because you can actually see it. And I find that harder, and I haven't had much success with screenplays. Clockwise was really the only reasonably successful one.
Anyone have any questions? Yes, back there, is that all right? Okay, go ahead, that's fine.
myself, no ideas come. But Lisa Meitner was a German physicist who worked with Hahn and Strassmann. And Hahn and Strassmann, she was Jewish and had to leave Germany, went to Sweden. And after she'd gone, Hahn and Strassmann identified the results of fission and established, up to that point, people have thought what happened when you bombarded the nucleus with neutrons is that it absorbed neutrons and became a heavier element still, what they call transuranic element. And Hahn and Strassmann, by unbelievably skillful chemistry, working with microscopically small quantities, established that, in fact, it broke down into two lighter elements emerged from it, which must mean that fission had occurred. And Strassmann wrote to Lisa Meitner in Sweden to tell her about these results, and they didn't believe them. They kept doing the experiment over and over again because it was a preposterous result. It can't come out lithium because lithium's about half the weight of uranium. And he wrote to Lisa Meitner to say what the problem was. And Lisa Meitner's nephew, called Otto Frisch, a very great Austrian physicist, and he came to visit her one Christmas in Sweden to sort of lighten her exile. And they walked around in the snow talking about these extraordinary results from Berlin. And together they pieced out the thought that this must be fission. And if you adopted Niels Bohr's picture of the nucleus as a liquid drop, in the case of a heavy metal heavy element like uranium, a very unstable liquid drop because it's so large, that just a neutron hitting it might actually cause it to break into two. But one of the interesting things is that Strassmann said afterwards that Lisa Meitner had been so dominant when she'd been working with them in Berlin that had she still been there, she would never have let them go on with this series of experiments because they've obviously gone off the rails somewhere. It must be something you would do with that. She was a most remarkable woman.
I'm not entirely sure I believe you when you say you know nothing about science.
I can tell you, it's extremely embarrassing after Copenhagen went on. And I had the script read by physicists and so forth. But I kept getting letters from scientists who'd seen it and who said, I think you've made a slight error here. I think when you say atom, you really mean molecule. I mean really awful basic things like that. But what struck me is that scientists are so nice. They all wrote in a friendly way, being very apologetic about having to explain there's something wrong with my play. Whereas if I'd written a play about lawyers or something, they'd have come down like a ton of bricks on me for making mistakes.
Any other questions? Yes, here at the front. Can we wait for a microphone?
When you're writing, what are the biggest obstacles that you encounter, and how do you get around them in the actual writing process?
There's a famous essay by Cyril Connolly about the problems that stand in the way of the writer, and one of them is the pram in the hall, and I can't remember what the others are, but they're all things that actually stop your writing. But the only real problem is either not having an idea, or having an idea and not seeing how to make it work. And they are real problems, and that's what writing is. The problem about writing is that what writing is thinking. And everyone knows from their experience of life that thinking is extremely difficult and tiring and wearing out. So that's why writing.
I agree, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
I had the pleasure of studying your novel Spies for my A-levels, and I wanted to know if you had experienced anything that Stephen experienced in the novel.
Yeah, you did Spies for A-level, and I didn't catch that.
He wanted to know if you'd ever actually experienced any of the sort of travails that Stephen undergoes in the novel Spies.
Right. Well, see, Spies is about two little boys in the Second World War, 11-year-olds or whatever, who get the idea that the mother of one of them is a German spy. And they did take off from something I remembered from that period. I had a kind of all the sort of background of the story in my mind for years and years and couldn't see how to focus it. And then I remembered that at some point in the middle of the Second World War, this great friend of mine who was dominated all our games. We invented everything. I'd never had any powers of invention as a child at all. Said to me one day, out of nowhere, my mother is a German spy. Well, it was obviously the start of another game. You know, we were going to just follow her around. And I can't remember what happened. I think we followed her around for a couple of hours. And in that time, she didn't get in touch with German high command, and she didn't steal the plans for any secret aircraft. And we got bored and gave up. But I started to think, supposing we'd been a bit more persistent and we'd followed her around for 2 weeks or whatever, what would we have made of her life? What would we have understood about an adult life? Because there would have probably been some odd, shady corners in it somewhere. Everyone's got some bits in their life that don't quite fit in with the rest. Some relatives they're a bit ashamed of or something like that. We'd have come across something that didn't quite fit in with all we knew about her. What would we have made of it? So that was the point of departure. But all the kind of background to the story, the relationship between the boys and the suburban street that they play in, all that really is a sort of fictionalized version of what I remember from my childhood.
Next question. Yes, there's one more here at the front.
Are there any new young playwrights that you're sort of interested in keeping an eye out to see what they do in the future?
I didn't quite catch that. Sorry.
Are there any new playwrights that are just emerging that you're interested to see what they do in the future?
There are a lot of writers who are, I think, terribly good, and I'm sure we'll go on to do even more wonderful things. I particularly admire Lee Rain. I don't know if Nina Rain, sorry, Lee's her mother, sorry. Nina Rain, thank you. Who wrote a play called Tribes, which was done at Laura Court. Absolutely terrific play, and I'm sure she'll do many more plays. Nina Rain.
Yes, in the middle.
One of the problems of getting older is forgetting more and more names. But it's particularly difficult if you work with actors because their name is part of their stock in trade. And if you can't remember their names, and you can't remember the names of your own characters they're playing, it's very difficult to communicate.
Hi. So, when you start a new writing project, what are your thoughts when you have to face the blank page or the first blank page?
Well, my thoughts on the first blank page, that it's impossible, that blank page is going to remain a blank page forever. It's very funny, even doing translations. If I do a translation, I absolutely marinate myself in the original, go back and forth through it, sort out any difficulties with vocabulary or allusions or whatever, until I'm absolutely confident that I'm at home in that play. And then I sit down and begin to work. And I think, I can't even translate the first stage direction. It's just, it's something very simple, like the hall at the Prozorov or whatever, but it's inherently in Russian, and there's no way I'm ever going to get it out of Russian into English. It just lives in Russian, and that's where it belongs. But I suppose you get beyond that and get started. And one of the good things and bad things about fiction, if you're writing your own fiction, is that once you get started, the characters seem to take on a life of their own. And a lot of writers hate other writers like me saying this because they think it sounds sort of sentimental, silly thing to say. But that's what it feels like. It does feel as if the characters begin to say things themselves and begin to do things themselves, which is nice, and it helps you out. But the problem is they don't always say and do what you want them to say and do. You've worked out this terrific plot for them, and they don't want to do it. They want to do something else. And I've often thought that writing fiction is a bit like being a parent with small children, or being an industrial manager or whatever with the staff, that somehow you're dealing with these other people who've got minds and feelings of their own, and you've got to somehow persuade them. You've got to make concessions to them, let them do part of what they want to do, and you've got to also persuade them to do part of what you want to do. And there's a lot of give and take and back and forth, and you've got to be tactful and so forth. So it's all a bit more exhausting and difficult than it at first seems. And sometimes they're so wayward that you've absolutely completely gone off the plot altogether. You've got to think of something else for them.
Yes, in the corner. Can you wait for a microphone, please, quickly?
Well, all those 4 last plays are just wonderful. Which is the greatest of them? I think possibly... I'm very attached to Vanya. I don't know why, but I am. But they're all terrific plays. But I've also got a soft spot for Chekhov's first play. What is Chekhov's first play? No one here knows. No one here knows the name of it, at any rate, because he didn't leave it with a name. The manuscript was left without a title page. And it's sometimes done under the title Platonov, because Platonov is the chief character. But I adapted it for the National Theatre under the title Wild Honey. And it's a maddening thing. It's about 6 hours worth of material. So you couldn't really do the whole thing. And he wrote it when he was certainly no older than 21. He may have been younger than 21. He can't have been any older than 21. And how he knew so much about life and so much about the world and so much about what it's like being middle-aged when he was 21, I have no idea at all. And he didn't know how to write plays, and it's a mixture of bits of existential angst and whatnot, and political drama and so forth, and farce. And it seemed to me that the best elements in the play were the farce. So I reconstructed it to bring out the farce. And it was rather unfair, because when it was done, the reviewers assumed that the first act, which was rather Chekhovian in tone, was Chekhov. And as it got turned into farce as it went along, it was my handiwork. So I got either the credit or the blame for the farce. And in fact, it's absolutely the other way around. The Chekhovian act I had written largely to get the play started quickly. And the more wildly farcical it became, the more blackly farcical, the more purely Chekhov it is. And people do forget that Chekhov was a comic writer. He began as a purely comic writer, writing comic pieces for the comic journals. And his first success with a play, when he was halfway through his career, he tried to write serious plays and they didn't have any success with them. His first success as a playwright was with commercial farces, short commercial farces for the commercial theatre. And it's always worth bearing in mind when you see Chekhov or read Chekhov or translate Chekhov, that he was a comic writer. I think one of the problems with the early English translations of Chekhov is that people didn't quite grasp that. If you don't realize there's comedy in what you're translating, it's very easy to get the tone wrong and make it all seem very sort of solemn and strange and weirdly Russian. But in fact, a lot of the humor in Chekhov's plays is very much like middle-class English humor. And you can imagine if someone, a Russian, translating something full of kind of ironic conversation middle-class people in this country have with each other, people are kind of avoiding the subject and making jokes and sort of joshing each other and so forth. If they didn't grasp that that was going on, they translated it literally into Russian, you get a very, very weird result.
Do you dislike being slightly, because of the success of Noises Off, being slightly labelled as a farce writer, a very successful farce writer, but a farce writer nonetheless?
I'm rather honoured to be described as a farce writer. It's a very difficult form, farce, and to write, I've written, I guess, 2 successful farces. I'm rather proud of that.
Yes, here in the middle.
I had 2 questions. I was interested to know how you supported yourself when you were emerging as a playwright. And I was also interested as to how much notice you think as a writer should take of your critics, your reviewers.
Well, the second question first, before I forget it, because I forget everything these days. I always read the reviews. Some people claim they don't read reviews, but I do, because a lot of judgments, particularly in the case of plays, a lot of decisions about the future of the play are going to be based on those reviews. And if you're going to have producers phoning up and saying, I'm terribly sorry we're taking the play off, you've really got to know what it's based on. And also, if you get bad reviews and you haven't read them, it's even worse if friends ring up and say, I shouldn't read that review if I were you. I shouldn't, it's really terrible. If you complete, the man's a fool, and so forth. And immediately you imagine something even worse than it was. So I do read all the reviews. And I think you can sometimes learn from bad reviews. And one of the better things about playwriting is that you often get a chance of another production, and get a chance to use some of the lessons you've learnt on the early productions. And sometimes, with bad reviews, often bad reviewers haven't haven't grasped really what's wrong, but they've seen that something's wrong, something's upset them, something's what wasn't clear. And sometimes you can sort of track back and discover what it was that's thrown them off course and put it right. How did I support myself? When I went down from Cambridge, I got a job as a reporter on what was then called the Manchester Guardian. And I wrote a column for them, a column for the Observer, and started writing novels. And then when I decided I was going to become a full-time writer, I also took a contract with the Observer to write occasional long reporting pieces, partly to pay the bills, and also because I think it's a good thing for writers of fiction occasionally to have to go out and look at the real world, just to remind them of how unlike what they imagine it is. So that's how I supported myself. I kept going with that until some money came in from the plays.
Any other questions? Yes, here in the corner, please.
Do you have a favourite theatre, either for its atmosphere or the practicalities of staging a play there?
Do I have a favourite theatre? I have to say I'm very fond of the New Hampshire Theatre because I helped to get it built. I was chair of the company that built it, and these days we had an architect and theatre specialists who were actually doing the design, but I was very involved in the practicalities of it. So I think it's a terrific theatre. I can't help being fond of it. But I love the National Theatre. The 2 bigger auditoria, the Olivia and the Littleton, are not ideal. They don't work very well as theatres. And the Cottesloe works much better. And now, weirdly, the National Theatre is rebuilding the Cottesloe, having got this perfect, adaptable theatre. Why they're rebuilding, I don't know, but they are. But there's something about the theatre. It's partly that they just have such good artistic directors, one after another, who put on such a terrific program of plays and done such good productions. And also because there's something exciting about that building. You go, and the foyers are terrific. And you go there and you know as soon as you get in the foyer, you're going to have a good time. You don't always have a good time when you get into the theatre, but you feel immediately this is going to be good. So I think I've really put the National Theatre down as my favourite place. But there's a lot to be said for those old-fashioned proscenium arch theatres from the 19th century that the great theatre architects like Matcham and Sprague did. They knew what they were doing, and their great skill, which I have to say Laston has not managed to replicate in the National Theatre. It was getting the audience very close to the stage. So even large audiences are brought very, very close to the stage. Very difficult to do. Theatre architecture is a very specialised and skilled business.
I think we just have time for a few more questions. Yes?
increasingly, as government funding cuts for the arts come into place and theatre is shown live all over the world from the UK, what do you think is the future of theatre in the UK? But more specifically, what is the future of your own work in the UK?
In terms of being shown on...
In being shown, in how theatre is going to go forward from now as it loses funding but gets shown globally.
Well, I have to confess, I've never actually seen one of those live broadcasts of a play from the National Theatre, for instance. They do, and I don't know how they come over. I don't think plays, theatre productions film terribly well, because the business of acting in the theatre and acting in a film are wildly different. I mean, acting in a film, you may well only be this far from the camera lens, and the slightest shifting of an eyebrow or the murmur or whisper or whatever registers very strongly. In a theatre, Michael Gambon described acting as shouting in the evening. And you do have to shout in a theatre. You have to make a lot of noise to get through to the back of the theatre. And if you see that in a film, it often looks crude. But it may work done as a live production. But I'll tell you what works terribly well done as live production is opera. Because you expect opera, either in the opera house or on the screen, to be rather over the top, very dramatic. And to be very close up to the singers and be able to see the subtitles without taking your eyes off the singers is wonderful. And the stuff, the live transmissions from the Meth, I think, are terribly good. But whether all theatre will eventually end up getting done that way, I don't know. I think there's something to be said for a live audience. It's very different doing something with a live audience, because the audience is so much, has such an influence on what's happening on the stage. Actors sense very quickly whether an audience is responsive or not. And if the audience warms to their performance, quite unconsciously their performance kind of warms as well, and that makes the audience response stronger. So you get positive feedback. Of course, you can also get negative feedback where the actors realize that the audience are not really quite enjoying, not quite with it for one reason or another, and their performance falls off slightly, and the reaction of the audience falls off slightly. And you can see, I've seen the things that have gone perfectly well, plays have gone perfectly well with other audiences, just disappear down the tubes because somehow the interaction hasn't paid off.
One last question.
There's somebody right here.
Yes, perfect.
Good evening. I just want to say I live in Kenya and I saw your play there, so it's definitely travelled the world like you said it has. I saw Noises Off. It was absolutely hilarious, fantastic. I've sort of heard that playwrights are very good people watchers, and that's how they kind of capture the subtleties and that they write about. Would you tend to agree with that?
Are playwrights good people watchers? I don't know. I don't feel I'm terribly good at this. I have a fellow playwright, wonderful playwright called Peter Nichols. And Peter Nichols claims I don't believe this literally, but he claims he has never invented a single line. He has simply written down what he's heard other people say. I don't think you take that quite literally, but he certainly has a very good ear for what other people say. I'm not sure that I have. I think I just have to make it up. One of the reasons I write fiction is I've got such a terrible memory. I would find it very difficult to write factual stuff. And if you make it up, you can always get around difficulties and you don't have to do much research. People watch people. Oh, I'm watching you all out there. You're all going to be in a place.
I think I'll just take this opportunity to finish on one final look to the future moment. Do you have anything in the pipeline for the future? Anything planned, any new works?
Well, I've got odd bits and pieces, but I'm writing the screenplay for my last novel, which is called Skios, and there's many difficulties in setting up a film, and whether we'll ever finally get it set up, I don't know, but possibly we will. And in the meantime, I'm writing draft after draft, as in the way that people do. of the screenplay.
Well, we look forward to seeing that, fingers crossed, at some point in the future. I think that would be a perfect time to stop. Thank you very much, Mr. Frayn, for coming and speaking. It's incredibly kind of you to come up on such a difficult day for travel. It's been incredibly illuminating and educating and just interesting to hear what it is you have to say. And I wish you the best of luck for the screenplay of Skios.
Thank you very much.